Hi students, welcome to Nature 270, Introduction to Ecology. This is lecture 1 in our series for the spring quarter. This will be going over chapters 1 and 2 of your text. So let's get started. Remember, we will always be reviewing Salish Kootenai College's 4 C's. I will try to introduce traditional ecological knowledge as part of our cultural understanding component in each lecture. I also want to encourage you, especially in the period of the self-isolation and COVID concern, to be a good citizen to yourself. Take good care and make sure you are taking really good uh, care of your health. For critical thinking, each week you will be asked to engage with homework questions that may have a starting point with the text that you currently have, but you may not always be able to get the answer straight from the text. I want you to learn to think critically. Take what I've taught you, apply it to a new situation to come up with the answer. For communication, I hope we can satisfy this in a lot of ways this quarter. You are always encouraged to join me during the Google Hangouts for my office hours. I also encourage you to communicate with one another using the discussion boards I've embedded into our class materials in Schoology. And also at the end of the quarter, you'll have an opportunity to communicate your research and your projects with the rest of the class. So let's get started. What we're up to today, this is our menu for what we're going to study. We're going to look at an overview of the term ecology. We'll be looking at a very famous case study by MacArthur on some birds in a forest ecosystem. And we'll also be looking at the impacts of climate change and what the global scope of ecological study is. Now, I look forward to teaching this class every year. I love ecology. I hope by the end of this quarter, you're going to love it too. It's really the summation of every single study. It's it's a discipline unlike any other. You need to have some understanding of a lot of different fields of science to be a good ecologist. And in fact, one could argue today, if you want to be a good ecologist, you have to be a good social networker. The amount of data, the scale of the questions, everything is getting so big and so global. It's really impossible to do ecology as a single researcher, by yourself in a lab or in a field setting anymore. That's where it started, but that's certainly not where the discipline of ecology is headed. And I hope you'll get as excited about it as I am by the end of the quarter. Okay, so what is ecology? Let's take a quick overview. Simply put, it's just studying the relationships of animals and plants with their environment. That sounds simple, but it's really difficult to do sometimes. The simple definition just doesn't really begin to evoke just how complex it can be to look at entire populations and communities of animals and plants and how they interact. It's getting easier. There's new techniques and new technologies that are coming online that really help, but it's not an easy study. Um, The biosphere is like the largest level of an ecological study. So we'll be looking at how your text breaks this down. So if you think of the biosphere as the largest level of ecology and ecological study, and ecosystems being subcomponents of that. So perhaps the best way to describe that is using a visual aid from your book. If you look in the first chapter of your text, you're going to see they show the entire planet representing a biosphere. It's everything. It's the entire planet Earth, terrestrial, aquatic habitats, the atmosphere, every biome on the planet, every animal on the planet, and every abiotic factor imaginable, right? The largest scale of study. And then you bring it all the way down to studying an individual species. So I think that diagram really helps you begin to appreciate just how complex this can be. Okay, I'll scroll down here a little bit. All right, so what is ecology? When we talk about that, what do we mean? Well, just repeating myself here, it's just relationships between plants, animals, and their environment. And throughout this text, we're going to look at researchers who looked at tiny little relationships between microscopic animals and their environment, or all the way up to very large scale studies. And they're all really interesting. Okay, so I wanted to take a step back. This isn't in your text, but I think I wanted to add this in, especially with our current pandemic concerns going on. A lot of people are asking questions that have not been asked before, right? And I love this short video because it asks one of those big and more modern questions. It's actually something that TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, has been speaking toward for centuries. One could argue for thousands of years, Native people have said nature has value, period. But today we're beginning to see that nature has a value that many modern people have not really thought about. And I could say a whole lot about this, but I think it's more fun for you to experience it yourself. So I'll play the video. Now, if you're downloading these lectures at home through the PowerPoints and you want to play these videos, it won't activate within the video or within the PowerPoint. You have to copy and paste this link into your web browser to get you to YouTube and play it, unless you're just following along live with me. So when I play videos during our class and these recorded lectures, I usually step away. So you'll see me leave your screen and then I'll come back when this is over. So have some fun with this. It's got a slow start here. The health benefits of going outside. Oops. Sorry about that. I must have popped it off. So this is a little tongue-in-cheek, kind of fun. And the first time I saw this, I thought it was a total parody, but actually I did some more checking, and I encourage you to do this too. There's a lot of countries now in Western Europe that when individuals go to the doctor and they complain of depression or just a general feeling of malaise, they're being prescribed nature. And there's actually being a lot of research done just to document what happens when we go outside. So, in the midst of this pandemic and all of this serious stuff, and of course, we do need to take it seriously, but I just want to encourage you. Maybe one of the best things you can do for yourself this quarter is just go outside, practice safe social distancing and all of that. But let's get outside and just help our general health. Okay, but back to the lecture. All right, so going back to your text, there are these levels of ecological organization going from the biosphere down to the individual. And as we move through this class, we're going to be kind of working our way through these different levels. I just want to keep touching back to these to let you know kind of how your book has all of this organized, okay? Now, the first case study we're going to look at is a forest case study that was designed to look at some bird communities, and it's often cited as one of these really classic ecological research projects that was performed back in the 1950s. So when we take a look at this gentleman named Robert MacArthur, cool guy, went out in the woods with some field glasses and he just started looking at spruce forests. And he wanted to know what birds were there and why they came, and just in general, what did they do? Now, he had a working theory, and he predicted that two species inhabiting the same ecological niche could not coexist. And that's just an old paradigm in ecology, right? If you have two animals that need the exact same resource in the exact same area, there's no way that both of them can live there. So he thought he would be able to perform a pretty classic niche study. Well, he was really surprised at what he learned. And the results of this study have gone on to form one of these paradigms in ecology, especially in forest communities. Now, I know some of you are going to be, or probably all of you, will be taking the field ecology course with Dr. Frizzell. He does an amazing job, and I know he's going to be having you engage with some forest ecology questions. So while you're out there, these are some kinds of things you might want to be looking for in your forest communities where you are doing your work. So let me scroll down here. So MacArthur went out and he was like, he's looking up in those spruce trees and he sees bay-breasted warblers and black-throated green warblers. Oh, if you ever get to hear these guys, they're so beautiful. They make such a sweet song. The Blackburnian warbler, and then the yellow rumped. Now, his theory was, hey, there's no way these guys can all live in the same place, right? But what he found is they absolutely could. And, if you are at a certain point in your academic career, you may look at this and go, well, duh, who wouldn't have known this? But back in the 50s, this was brand new information. So what he found out is they divided themselves up. They did something called resource partitioning. So you have these trees, they've been color coded based upon where these different species of warblers would focus to get the food, cover, and other habitat needs within the same tree. So you have this black-throated green right here in the middle, the Blackburnian hanging out way up on the top, the Cape May even up above. So there's a little bit of overlap between these two and a little bit of overlap between these two. But these guys were able to partition their niches so that 5 different species of warblers could inhabit the same tree. Pretty cool stuff. Scroll down. Okay, so that was 1958. And if you wanted to create a research project, and if you wanted to collect data and write up a summary of data that would change the course of ecological study and be groundbreaking, you just could be one guy hanging out in the woods in Canada with a pair of field glasses. Can't really do that anymore. Today, when we're looking at resource partitioning, the question goes way beyond one patch of spruce and fir trees in one part of the world. Now we're looking at, why do animals migrate? Where do they go? When do they go? Do males and females of the same species go at the same time? Do they feed at the same places? Do they eat the same things? And we're able to ask these super complex questions now because we have these amazing tools. And one of them is isotope studies. Now, what's really cool is you can track isotopes within organisms. In this case, birds. There's this study in your book where they look at the accumulation of isotopes in bird feathers in order to better understand migration patterns and migration differences between males and females. Now, this study was done on American redstarts, and what they did, the scientists wanted to find out how many isotopes of carbon could be detected in redstarts based upon their diet. Now, all of us can upload isotopic particles based upon what we eat, right? Same thing with birds. So if they're eating one type of food, they're going to have a very different carbon signature than if they're eating another type of food. And this study was really great. It pulled that out. It found out that when American redstarts migrate, the males tend to leave first. They tend to get to the destination faster, and they set up territories in areas where they get optimal foods. So they're going to have a very specific isotopic signature compared to females who tend to arrive later, who maybe don't get the best habitats. And they were even able to drill down a little further into the data and figure out that, hey, if a male had mated with a female and their offspring, if the eggs didn't hatch or if they were predated upon, well, that little guy is freed up to go and do even more optimal foraging than he would if he had to hang out and feed babies. So they were able to just collect tail feathers, look at the isotopes, and see this big difference between males, females, and offspring. Cool stuff. But it doesn't end there. Not only can we use isotopes to look at American red starts and their migration patterns, they can be used for virtually any organism that migrates. Isotopic studies have been applied to African elephants, sockeye salmon, and other species to give really precise and high resolution data to ecologists that simply was not available 50 years ago. All right. So um, these become really important when you're dealing with species that can cover massive distances. So the biggest migrator on the planet, you know who it is or what species it is? I'll give you a moment. It's an Arctic tern. Those guys can pretty much go from one pole to the other. Now, if you were trying to study the migration pattern of the Arctic tern and you had a limited budget, isotopes would get you there. You could analyze the uptake of certain carbon isotopes to determine where these birds go. And in fact, that's exactly what has been done to determine their range, where they stop as they migrate, and to evaluate um, differences between males and females and their migratory patterns. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, so the three principles of isotopic tracking include the isoscape terrain. Now remember, isotopes get taken up based upon what an animal eats. So you have to understand how that animal is interacting with its environment as it moves across different landscapes. That will affect the types of isotopes it'll be taking up. Um, you can have differences in your baseline. So, for instance, an adult male of most species will eat more than an immature young of the same species. So, you have to understand something about its natural history, its behavior, its migration patterns. Again, this is a classic ecological study because you're looking at an animal and how it interacts with its environment. You also have to look at time, right? So for some short-lived species, you may not have to commit a whole lot of time. So if you're looking at monarch butterflies and doing isotopic studies on a short-lived animal, that would have one type of spatial and monetary scale versus an African elephant that can live for 50 to 75 years. Okay. All right. So, with American Red Starts, looking at all of these factors, the authors of this study had to look at reproductive effort, where they were when they started molting, right? When they were getting ready to fly, their feather color, and their migratory routes. And if you want to read the actual paper, I put in the title of it here. Here's all the authors that were involved. You might enjoy taking a look at that. So in that paper, the quick summary is there was a 2-year study. I'll let you guys read this for yourselves. It's also summarized quite well in your book, but it just talks about this classic study and how they found out the difference between male, female, and immature young's behavior patterns and dietary patterns as they were migrating. Pull this up here. All right. So In all of my lectures, I like to include these pause and reflect slides, and I want you to use these as you go through and study. This is an opportunity for you to do metacognition, to think about your thinking. Pause for a moment and ask yourself if you can give the definition for ecology. What is ecology? What is an ecosystem? How did early ecologists study these ecosystems? And how are isotopes used? And how are they used today? Okay, all right. Now, we also want to take a look at some more data on this forest canopy research. Now, again, this is a research study done in more isolated spatial scales. I want to pop back up here and have you engage with this again. There's a question in your homework for your first week that talks about the inherent problems if we organize ecology based on the stepwise gradient from biosphere down to individual. Can you think of some reasons why this is a little bit misleading to organize the study of ecology this way into these discrete compartments? Got some ideas? You'll engage with this question in your homework. So I just want you to take a close look here. This looks very orderly. It looks very organized. We go from this planetary basis down to the individual. But in real life, guys, I wish I could be right in the classroom with you. It's a hot mess. All of this stuff is interacting all of the time. The interactions between biomes and climate and animals migrate and species die out and other species come in and occupy their niche. This gets very messy. The real life study of ecology is not neat and tidy and confined to discrete boxes. There is a lot of interaction going across all levels. So keep that in mind as we continue through this next portion of the lecture. So we pop back down here. We're looking at a forest canopy, and in this case, we're looking at a rainforest habitat. And when you look in rainforests, I'm sure you guys have encountered this before. Rainforests are really divided up into different zones. One tree can support a multitude of life from the ground floor up to the top of the canopy based on light levels, rainfall, nutrition, and other interactions of other plants and animals up and down that vertical column. The study of rainforests historically was really made complex due to the fact it was hard to get to them. There was a lack of equipment that would allow you to study them well. So I was really excited when I found this YouTube video on this new way to study rainforests. I hope you'll enjoy this. Okay, so that gives you a pretty good overview of the diversity just going up and down the trunk of a rainforest tree from ground floor into canopy. Let's take a look here. So the methods to access these really unique ecosystems are improving. You can look here, early climbing gear was necessary, and you can imagine what if you were the world's greatest researcher, but you were afraid of heights, right? That'd be a huge limitation. Well, now we've got options. We've got drones, and if you guys are interested, SKC is offering a drones class, and it's just a wonderful skill for you to pick up as you're going through and getting your degree and developing your skills as a scientist. I'm encouraging every student I know get drone pilot training if at all possible. The other really cool tool that was made, famous in the Jurassic Park movies were these elevated blinds, being able to hop in these cages, be craned up, kind of elevated up above the canopy, and do your research actually separate from the tree itself. Amazing amounts of data, amazing high quality data has been collected in this way. It's just so cool. And, maybe one of you is going to come up with an even more innovative strategy to study these habitats. Okay, so stop for a moment and think, how is it different in studying an ecosystem level study where you're having to look at all populations, all animals, all plants, all biota, all abiota? How is that different from studying a single organism? What tools are needed to study rainforest habitats? And what have researchers learned about nutrient transport in rainforests? Now, that video talked a little bit about it. Let's go right back up here and take a look. We know that nutrient transport is really complex down there. You have your leaf litter, your decay can build up, but typically forest litter in rainforest areas is very thin. A lot of the nutrition is coming from the rain and running down the trunk, and these epiphytic plants that are almost like parasites on the trunk are moving resources and energy from one place to another. It's fascinating. Really, no other environment like it. Okay, so let's take a look at climate and ecological change. So if we scooch down here again, we just remind ourselves an ecosystem is a study of all plants and animals in a spatial area and how they interact with their environment and with each other. So a lot of researchers over the years have asked a very basic question. How have ecosystems changed over time? For a long period, it was assumed that how an ecosystem behaved at present was how it had always behaved in the past. At the turn of the century, the disciplines of paleontology and biology began to merge. Fossil evidence was being collected, and we began to realize that animals did not live in the same places in the past as they do in the present. that their environments had shifted dramatically. And we see it really well locally. If you drive from the Flathead Valley south towards Missoula, you see these ridge lines, these lake level marks on the hillsides around you, and realize that most of the Flathead Valley was underwater. It was several hundred feet under the top of Lake Missoula 10,000 years ago. So we begin to have an appreciation that our environments change over time and they can change dramatically. There's a little bit of sleuthing to this, a little bit of history and archaeology to this. So in your text, there's a really classic study about a gal who looked at deposition of pollen in lakes and ponds in the Appalachians to kind of peer backwards into time and see how these ecosystems had shifted. This has a whole new study. It's called paleoecology. So you'll recall I mentioned earlier that ecology really requires a lot of different disciplines. You need to know a lot about birds. You need to be an ornithologist, a lot about plants, a botanist, a lot about water movement, hydrology, perhaps a river and stream biology. So maybe the discipline of limnology comes in, mammalogy. I mean, I could go on and on. So this whole new study got developed called paleoecology. Hope you enjoy this. Again, anytime you want to see the links at home, you can just copy and paste the YouTube address. Get this started here.
Maybe you remember the first time you saw a dinosaur fossil on display in a natural history museum, or even just a picture of fossils in books or online. It's easy to get lost imagining what the world looked like when those stone bones, claws, and teeth were still part of living creatures. But when scientists really want to take themselves back in time, they don't just rely on fossils. There are a lot of slightly less glamorous samples, from ancient grains of pollen to bubbles of air trapped in ice. They can help us piece together older ecosystems. NATR has even spawned its own field of science called paleoecology. And paleoecologists aren't just learning about the past, they're trying to predict the future. Researchers find traces of extinct ecosystems in a lot of places, including rock and the layers of sediment at the bottom of lakes. New blankets of sediment are laid down constantly as nearby rocks and minerals break into tiny pieces. But the rock gets further the deeper you go, and scientists can use these layers to piece together how things have changed over time. For example, thanks to pollen and frozen sediment that we collected from a lake in Indiana, we know that beech trees became way less abundant in the Great Lakes region of the US starting about 8,000 years ago. Beech trees burn pretty easily. But in the part of the sediment course from that time, patterns of pollen, larvae, and minerals hint that drought may have killed off these trees rather than fire. Solving these cases doesn't just tell us about the past, we can use this stuff in sediment cores to figure out how climate shifts might be related to changes in ecosystems. That can give us an important clue on how today's anthropogenic or human-caused climate change might affect our world in the centuries to come. Mercury particles in lake sediment, for instance, show that the world's boreal forests, the evergreen forests here in the Arctic, were set ablaze during a medieval climate anomaly. This anomaly was a period of unusually warm temperatures that started around 1,000 years ago and lasted several centuries. Back then, the warming was caused by a strong fluctuation in ocean currents that changed how heat was distributed around the globe. This is very different from the changes going on today in the atmosphere. But the warming of the medieval climate anomaly is similar in scale to what we're going we typically lose some water because it evaporates. It turns out that many plants have adapted so that their stomata can take in more CO2 without letting too much water escape. This, among other things, makes researchers think that climate change will have complex effects that aren't necessarily predictable. Thanks to gas bubbles trapped in thick Arctic ice, paleoecologists also know that the growing amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is totally unprecedented. These four samples from some places go back an astonishing 800,000 years. And in all that time, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have never risen this quickly. So this time, the changing atmosphere could outpace ecosystems' ability to adapt. This might sound scary, but we're arming ourselves with knowledge that will help us deal with the challenges ahead. If you want to know about how Earth's ecosystems responded to climate shifts in the past, the more prepared we'll be. It's like that old saying, those who don't understand the past are doomed to repeat it. And if you want to arm yourself with more knowledge about the past, check out our sister show Eons, which dives deep into all the incredible things that have happened on our planet over the past 4.6 billion years. Just head over to youtube.com/eons and subscribe.
Okay, I'll turn the volume down a little bit on this. I hope you enjoyed that. So you can see paleoecology has a lot to offer to the modern ecologist, and actually many other disciplines too. All right, so let's evaluate the scope of ecology. What can it teach us? What are its limitations? All right, so if again, ecology is the study that looks at the relationships between organisms and their environment, we have a pretty huge variety of approaches that we can take to study these relationships. Do we go to the micro scale or the scale of the biosphere? Do we look at the interactions of just a few organisms, or do we try to do true community studies and look at every single organism in a certain environment and how they interact? Well, you need to take a look at these different criteria before you design your project. What resources are needed in the field, the lab? How much observational data are you going to need? And how much hands-on work has to be done? That affects the scope of any ecological field study. So, before you go out and do your study, it's often a good idea to remind ourselves of what exactly is science and what is the scientific method. I always like to start here with students. I know some of you come from a forestry background, some wildlife and fisheries, and sometimes you just have to take this class and you could be from a different discipline altogether. So I want to make sure that whoever takes my classes understands what science is and what it is not, and what the scientific method can do and what it cannot do. Okay, so science is just a systematic way of learning that allows us to test a theory, accumulate knowledge, maybe reject some theories, or decide, wow, we've got enough evidence here that this one theory seems to be the one that explains what we're observing, these natural processes that we're observing. But science and the scientific method also gives us a uniform way to test, to analyze, and ultimately to discover. Okay, so what is the scientific process? All right. Well, first, this is straight out of your text and it says you start with an observation. I would say you start with a question. And it's been my experience that when students go from their freshman year at SKC up to their senior year and they have to do a senior thesis, the hardest part is coming up with a good question, right? So you need to practice thinking about your thinking. But come up with a good question. Then after that, go out and make some observations. From there, you can develop your hypothesis. Think about your question, but that's not enough. You have to think about how you can test that question. Now, you're either, depending on the type of study, you're going to go and do an experiment. A lot of science tends to be considered as experiment driven. But for those of us who are ecologists and wildlife and fisheries biologists, We actually don't do a lot of experimentation. We do a lot of observation, but both will get you there. And then you look at your results and you ask yourself, does the data I've collected, the experiment I've performed, does it reinforce that hypothesis I came up with, or does it reject it? Now, here's what I want you to know. I don't know if I have this on the midterm. If not, I'm probably going to put it on there. So write this down. What can the scientific method do, and what can it not do? I want to make sure you understand that the scientific method cannot, and I repeat, it cannot prove anything. Okay, so when you hear talking heads on the news say science has proven, be careful with that. Hypothesis testing is simply a method used to determine how something is, all the ways something cannot happen, not all the ways that it can, right? So each time we test something, we're asking a very simple question. Um, is my hypothesis proven by this or not? Is it disproven? So what you're looking at is methods that either work or don't. And you do repeated experiments, repeated observations to determine what doesn't work, right? So the scientific method is essentially about proving what doesn't happen. It cannot be used to prove what does. I know that sounds maybe counterintuitive, but just think about new technologies, new data that's coming online and becoming available. We might, in our arrogance, say that we have proven something and we know for sure it does not happen. But all we have to do is wait a few years till a new breakthrough, a new technique arrives, and we're like, oh, wait, yeah, that can happen that way. So be careful that you understand the scientific method is in the business of disproving things, not proving them. Okay. So this is just a flow chart. This is straight out of your text. I'm not going to read this to you. You guys can all read yourselves, but just make sure you understand the process of the scientific method from developing a hypothesis, collecting observations, or performing an experiment, and analyzing your results. So then, we've discussed science, we've discussed the scientific method. What's a theory? Well, hypotheses are supported but not proven. Remember, we can't prove something does happen. We can only prove X, Y, and Z do not occur. A theory is something that's consistently supported by a hypothesis. Gravity is a good example, right? Doesn't matter where we go on the globe, we throw things up in the air, they do come down. And that has been tested enough and repeated enough that it's gone from just being a hypothesis to being an accepted theory that explains why force and matter and motion work on planet Earth. Now, theories can change if, like I mentioned before, we get enough data or the data is collected in a new way and we're able to see things in a new way. So here's an example, and maybe this will help. For many years, there was the thought that the Australopithecine fossil Lucy was our first and most ancient human ancestor, humanoid type ancestor. And this was based on looking at the fossil evidence and the bones, and we looked at lots and lots of bones and compared them, and it seemed like a really good hypothesis that was segueing into a really good theory until we had an emerging technology of genetics analysis, particularly mitochondrial RNA analysis, made available. We were able to extract mitochondrial RNA from Lucy and find out, oh, she was definitely simian, meaning she was definitely ape-like, not a progenitor to humans. So again, were the first scientific methods incorrect on that? Was the hypothesis testing incorrect? No, it was all sound and valid science. It just did not have this access to this new and groundbreaking technology. And today, genetics is really changing everything. If you've taken my zoology class, you've heard another example of this. For probably 150 years, there was this idea that all life on the planet went from a single celled organism up through this tree of life to more and more complex organisms. And that was supported by a lot of data, a lot of observations from a lot of different locations. And the thought was, wow, this hypothesis has made it to theory. Well, now, again, through genetics, we're able to learn that there's something called lateral gene transfer. And because of that, some of our simple organisms, when we look at their DNA, they have DNA from lots and lots of other species mingled in there with their own. So you have some single celled animals that have more DNA from other species than from their own. So, this idea that life progresses in a lineal fashion from simple to complex has kind of been turned on its ear. Was it because the early researchers did poor science? No, they just did not have access to this groundbreaking technology that we do now. And I can't help but wonder what's ahead in each of your careers. What new technique? There may be somebody listening to this lecture in this class who comes up with a new breakthrough technology. Wouldn't that be cool? Okay, but I also want to talk to you about TEK. You know, for years, so many textbooks have been written that kind of make it sound like all great science has been accomplished by some random white guys. And nothing could be further from the truth. Today is an exciting time because ecologists, especially conservation ecologists, are looking back, reaching back into the stored wisdom of indigenous people who lived on landscapes in a balanced fashion for thousands of years. And we've begun looking to these people groups for deep insights into how ecosystems function, how they functioned historically, how they could function better in the present, and what techniques and tools could we use to understand them better and study them with greater proficiency. My sincere desire is at the end of this course, you have a really huge respect for TEK, and that when you design your own research projects, you try, when and if at all possible, to incorporate TEK research methods because you will simply get a better research project and product. Now, here at SKC, we have a researcher in-house, Sarah Hoagland, and she's amazing. If you're in the forestry department, you've had an opportunity to meet her. But in this short Vimeo video, again, the address for that is here at the bottom of your screen. She talks about her research on owls and how she uses TEK to do her research.
The reason why I'm so passionate about combining research I've always been very driven about wildlife, the animals in general, and it's always been something that I've looking at looking. I think right now the 21st century, the species that I shared before with the bear, I feel to some degree I'm here to sort of protect them from conservation and for indigenous people, we feel like those animals are related to us. And so it's kind of like an opportunity to serve our ancestors and serve future generations. But that owl is sort of at this interface. It makes for a good symbol extend for all those roles there have been I work with the Mexican style down, and so in order to study their reproduction and occupancy rates, we visit historical sites and hunt. Ideally, the male and female will respond to us, and they'll let us know that appears occupying that site. And as a follow-up step, once we determine that a site is occupied back here, then we put out live bait, and that's live mice that we use, and the owl will come down and grab the mouse and take it to its nest. Right now, the biggest threat to the spawn now is large standing coastal wildfires. And so the only way to sort of reduce that risk for the next sundown is to do field treatments and to do some forest clearing and remove some of the wood essentially out of those layers. It's about finding that balance between providing habitat needs for owl and reducing fire risk. The owl means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's their sense that they're sort of the goal of the parents or the serious violent animal that comes without even really noticing. They're more than just cute. Cute is like anthropomorphic side, but there's definitely a spiritual connection, that I have with it. And I mean, for instance, in Hawaiian culture, you see an owl that's seen as a family protector.
When you call them and they respond to you, it's no greater sense of humor in the world. It's actually almost talking to this different species.
So family cases are learning from it out for the lab rats that's going down in the early 90s. A lot of folks in small rural communities lost a lot of jobs when owls existed. So there's a really wide spectrum of how the owls get seen even just in the last 30 years. So it affected people's livelihoods very seriously. So the research is very sensitive, and I completely respect that. Like, I'm not in this lawyer about to try to render. Like, I was in New Mexico and kind of reviewing, but I'm not from this place, so I very much miss it the entire time here. It's a very culturally sensitive species, and so at the most basic level, there's sort of a negative connotation that is going on to the rest of the country.
Actually, spotted owls, well, not just spotted owls, any owl, they tend to be messengers. It's not a blanket across the board that owls are bad. It can be whatever. But for the most part, people are very uncomfortable when they see them. It was really hard to find counsel, even though they were worried about the economic impact of the fires and the fall down. And those people have the people making their jobs and the people that feed the people food and so forth. So the council, they would probably say that's not what council is good. There's a reason why these people happen. But now I think it's become this way for people to get involved with things but not really understand. So that a good example here, we're in the Southwest, we get 45 to 30 inches of precipitation a year, so that's really snow. We're not the rainforest, they get 10 times the precipitation. A year, a totally different type of forest ecosystem. I understand people have good intentions, but not all of them work in those places. There's a tremendous amount of forests are really important. So forests are basically watershed, water comes from the Southwest. habitat for two good plants and animals. It's tremendously important for people to come to the activities in their numbers. But also some very special connections because their ancestral homeland places of their cultural and spiritual significance to people. It's not a bad knowing. It's only a message. It gives us a message. Things that might ignore that still put on our way. It tells us it's time to pray. Time to pray for the family. Time to pray for somebody that might feel. Maybe it's time for somebody that has finished their walk on Mother Earth. We don't hear them. We don't hear them. Some people have a misconception that they go to the extreme and then they begin to hear things that they do have not. We live in harmony with those things. We don't bother them. We don't interfere with them. They have their own way of life. But at times they communicate with us. They tell us things that we need to ask. We need to listen. And when the world is changing, we need to listen. And the climate is going to change the surface. We need to listen.
The owl, to some degree, drives a lot of what happens in our forest landscape, what we can and can't do in the forest. And so it's sort of a natural species to study that way because it has such a large footprint. And so ironically now we're looking at not necessarily clear cutting up the habitat, but cleaning up the habitat. So we expect to see more issues related to the cloud habitat and climate change.
Basically, what it's likely to do factors of increased severe wildfires, increased microbes and insects, and trees. Trees create a beacon and dry out this. So it makes it more vulnerable.
So the fact that we are facing this really complicated issue makes our work even more valuable because then the tribe is really active in the enrichment. So here's a place where we can sort of look at how do we find that balance.
I think we are really strong focused on forest management. I'm really concerned that we will lose it in a few years. I'm really concerned half of the things we've learned over the years. We're trying to get something that lost art poetry is not something people go to school for nowadays. I think that's where we really need to kind of stop and invest to really cultivate that. Nurture them and help them get into some of these specifics. There are very good resolutions in the West. The philosophy actually recently said are going to find a lot more because the population grows and we have more of those resources. And many of those reservations are very unique natural ecosystems. And it's going to be imperative for Native American biologists to try to understand the consequences of having extracted those resources and forests and habitat. And I think it'll be up to us to come back to with our own culture and see how that those biologists fit into our own culture.
Western science has a lot of great knowledge, and in most cases it's not a source of knowledge. Whereas Trinitarian traditional philosophy knowledge, the business science, data science, that has more of a long-term perspective and more of a holistic worldview. And I think combining those two, that's starts to decline, it's some of the indication that the health of the food chain is declining as well. So they're linked so tightly together.
We spent a lot of our time living in the city, not really noticing what God has given us out there, such as the birds that you were talking about. Spend time alone in the mountains. Spend time alone with what God has given you and communicate with you. And then we'll see.
Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed that. It gives you an idea of the type of real world research being done by folks right here at SKC, as well as it gives you an insight into how you can use traditional ecological knowledge to do really great research. Okay, so I encourage you to take a moment, pause and reflect. Make sure you understand what science is. Make sure you understand what the scientific method is, what it can and can't do, and how can TEK be used to help us as we move into examining modern issues in science. Okay, we're going to move into chapter 2, and I can move through this chapter pretty quickly because a lot of it is review. But we're going to be looking at climate on the large scale, components of climate, soil and terrestrial biomes. Okay, so your book does a wonderful job of sharing some case studies of what has happened in certain ecosystems when climate and the effects of climate have altered species composition, and as a byproduct of that, altered ecosystem level interactions. So, in the case study in your text, you have this very special kind of tree and it drops its fruit. And for many years, it depended upon alpaca and llama species to move this fruit around by eating them and dropping them in their droppings. And then, as a result of climate change, these species get lost, and suddenly there's a reduction in the number of these trees. Well, in the study, what they did is the scientists and the people in that community just switched the disperser. The loss of one species meant, hey, let's use horses, donkeys to do the same thing. So in Costa Rica, Jansen et al. Went down there, did this study, and found that the ecosystem service, the function that llamas and alpacas would have historically served, could be equally performed by another ungulate, in this case, horses. Interesting study. The other thing I want you to be aware of in chapter 2, there is this classic diagram. You've probably seen this since you were in middle school, but just the Earth's rotation and how it tilts on its axis as it orbits around the sun affects the amount of sunlight different regions of the Earth get, and that's what gives us our seasons. The other interesting thing is because of this rotation, we rotate wind patterns and wave patterns on the surface of the ocean and up in the upper atmosphere. And that gives us air current and water current. And that starts setting up these temperature zones along the Earth's surface as well as up in the atmosphere. So, one of the things I always like my students to understand is we have this sweet spot on the planet between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude, and the equator is right there in the middle. But that area, that habitat above and below the equator, that 30 degrees, is where most of the world's population resides. And it's also where most of the world's protein exists. Now, we in a landlocked state like Montana tend to think of protein being deer and bison, and that's true. But for most of the world, protein means fish. And most of the world's population lives in a region where most of their meat comes from the ocean or from the sea. One of the impacts of climate change that's really devastating is it's heating these waters up so much that our big ocean going pelagic swimming fish are migrating to try to get to cooler water. And as a result, they're leaving this zone that's very, very rich in life, human life. So we have a lot of people on the planet beginning to suffer from food shortages due to climate change. We also know that warm air drives air movement, right? So warm, moist air rises, cold air condenses and can descend, or it can uh, drop its precipitation as rain or snow. And again, we have those belts of the 30-degree north south. That's a big, big area for human habitation. Okay. We also can see as we're doing ecological studies, the Earth behaves very differently in the northern hemisphere. Okay, we have currents that go clockwise, and in the southern, I'm sorry, counterclockwise in the north, clockwise. Good. I should just read this over here. Clockwise in the north, I had it right the first time. Counterclockwise in the south. Those current patterns have everything to do with animal movement, animal migration, and the distribution of protein in many of the world's oceans. So, why am I spending so much time talking about this? Why is so much ink on the page in your textbook about this? What's the big deal with climate? Well, it affects everything. It affects animal behavior. It affects foraging behavior, migration routes, migration timing. Seasonality is key to so many animal species. And when we disrupt that seasonality, what we call phenology, the timing of special life events, both for plants and animals, we can start really messing up a lot of processes. So, for example, if it's important for, let's say here in Montana, huckleberries go into flower late July, beginning of August before they fruit. Well, with climate change, that is hastening, that's speeding up. So, what if huckleberries develop their blooms in May or June? Well, the pollinators, the bumblebees, and other insects that um, have specifically evolved to pollinate these plants, what if they're not ready by then? What cascading effect can climate have upon phenology, the timing of biologic processes? It's a big study all by itself. Okay, so let's take a look at climate diagrams. Your book does a lot of explanation on this, so I'm not going to go over it too much. I just want you to know how to read these things. So on this axis over here, on your y-axis to the left, you have temperature. On the other vertical axis to the right, we're going to have amount of rainfall, and then you've got the month of the year below. Lots of information here, right? So if it's not shaded, that means the water could be below freezing. So we see from January to April, we could have water temperatures or air temperatures that are pretty cold. Then we have our seasonal period that's shaded here, that's our warmer months, and then we can look at the patterns, right? Tremendous amount of data summarized on a single graph. I looked at a similar plot just for Montana, so we would have something we could relate to here. And if you take a look at this one, you could see time on the bottom, precipitation on this side, temperature over here. So we begin to see, hey, February is typically the coldest month, and our July, August, September tend to be our warmer months. And then you get this precipitation curve here, right? So again, make sure you know how to read these kinds of graphs. Climate graphs are critical in the studies of ecology. They're typically in research papers, and they'll likely show up to haunt you on a midterm or a final. Next, I want to talk about soil. We've talked about climate and its role in an ecosystem. We have to talk about the role of soil. At the last part of today's lecture, we're going to look at different biomes. And one of the ways that biomes are described and organized is based on soil characteristics. So if you've always just thought soil is a bunch of dirt, I hope today you get a brand new appreciation of just how important this is. If you do a lot of gardening or farming or grew up ranching, you already know this, but soil is critical. It's a complex mixture of organic and inorganic elements. You need bacteria, you need fungal mycorrhiza in there. And each layer of soil can be very complex. And in some places, so complex that you can assign multiple soil horizon descriptions to all of that dirt that's subsurface. So let's take a look. When we look at biomes, we are often looking at what the characteristic plants are. But you really got to think those plants can only be there if there are characteristic soils, right? So if you look at the world's biomes, they're divided up based on rainfall, plant life, growth, seasonality, precipitation patterns. And for the remainder of today's lecture, I just want to do a really quick overview. Your book does a great job summarizing these, so I'm going to go through these pretty rapid fire. One of the most hammered habitats today are tropical rainforests. We start with this one. This one has a very specific location on the globe. Soils are generally extremely rich, but very thin. So when these areas get logged and they lose that very thin layer of topsoil, there's just no coming back from that. It's very, very difficult to rebuild rainforest floor habitats. Incredibly complex, very biodiverse, and typically heavily settled by humans. Next, we have tropical dry forests, and you can read those characteristics here. Again, these have been intensively cleared because they also are great sites for either growing crops or running herds of animals. We have the tropical savanna. This one is very different for us here in Montana. We don't have an example of that here in our state, but these occur in tropical dry forests between 10 and 20 degrees of the equator. So that's 10 and 20 degrees north and south. Okay, these can have periods of wet weather by prolonged seasons of drought. As a result, the soil tends to be kind of hard packed. You get these little grassy, shrubby things growing out there. Plant communities tend to be a little stunted. Okay. Our desert can have cold desert, hot deserts. Some can be a little bit of a little bioproductive, some really not at all. Like this would be the Gobi, very, very challenging habitat, right? Animal abundance typically tends to be low, rainfall very low, and these can occur also within the 30-degree north and south latitudes of the planet Earth. Mediterranean woodlands and shrublands, again, I'll let you just read the characteristics over here. Boreal forest, this is a huge swath of habitat that is circumpolar around all of the top of the planet. It covers 11% of the Earth's total surface. Some of our last remaining really big animals, northern animals, live in these habitats. Relatively high animal density and very little human intrusion. These tend to be pretty rugged habitats, and as a result, they've kept people out. We have our tundra habitats. These are getting a lot of attention now because they have a permafrost layer underneath, and that permafrost is a lot of trapped carbon in the form of methane. And now that we're in the era of climate change, that methane is beginning to bubble up and turn into a gaseous state. And as it's released from the tundra, it's like a ticking time bomb. We know now that in some communities in Siberia, teachers are guiding children through safety and preparedness drills in the event that the tundra habitat explodes, that this methane bubble starts coming out. It's like dropping bombs on Hiroshima. The amount of gas that can be released and the subsequent explosions that could occur could be similar to us dropping bombs on Japan in World War II. It's really extreme. We have our mountain habitats. That's the ones here in Montana we're most familiar with. And again, I'll let you read those characteristics of those habitats there. The one I didn't list here is temperate forests. And globally, that is one of the most degraded habitats on the planet. It has a lot of diversity, a lot of human uh, intrusion and interaction in those habitats, and a lot of deforestation. I think there's a question in your homework about that, which is why I put that in there. Your text doesn't have this. I added this. The largest biome on the planet is aquatic. It's the ocean. Okay, and you have this question in your homework. I want to challenge you with this. Why do animals that live at depths of greater than 600 meters, 1,800 feet, have eyes, even though they live their entire lives without sunlight? And the flip side of that question is, what about animals that live in caves? Why did they lose their eyes altogether? I want you guys to think about that, engage with that with your homework this week. The other concept that was brought up in chapter 2 of your text is this river continuum model. And so here we have a river, small stream up in the mountains as a headwater. They get bigger and bigger and bigger as they go downstream. Notice upstream, lots of canopy, lots of shade, tend to be steep, fast flowing. Most of the food coming in to the stream at the top is from leaves from the trees themselves. Most of the food coming into the river or the stream down gradient is just what flows down from above. Notice the banks are further apart. You're not going to get a lot of food from riparian vegetation. It's going to be brought downstream. Okay. So, do animals in the headwaters rely upon photosynthesis, or do they rely on food falling in? Well, up here, they rely on their food falling in. Down here, much more reliant upon photosynthesis, sun striking this water and acting upon it to engage phytoplankton and, of course, zooplankton. Okay? You have a question about that in your homework. The last few concepts here deal with resilience and fragility. All right, two different ends of the spectrum. You can have ecosystems or biomes that are incredibly resilient. They can get hammered, dredged, drained, fire move across them, and they can bounce back, right? We have others that cannot tolerate any impact at all. So take a close look in your text. Look at those paragraphs in your text in chapter 2 that talk about which biomes have been the most impacted. Terrestrially, I'll just give you one of the answers there, and that's temperate forest. And which have been least impacted? Think about why that would be, and how may these patterns change in the future in the era of both climate change and invasive species. These questions get really complex pretty fast. Okay, so today I really want you, at the close of this first lecture, stop for a moment and think, what does geography have to do with cultural development? You ever stop to think about that? where your culture developed on the planet has a lot to do with what types of traditions were developed, right? So if you look at Inuit people at the North Pole, very different traditions than Pygmy cultures in the Congo of Africa, right? Geography does have a tremendous influence on culture. But what happens when climate starts shifting and our ability to live in different places starts getting impacted because of changes in climate extremes? What impact could this have on culture? Throwing a little bit of philosophy into you at the end of an ecology lecture. Remember, it's um, really great if you come up with questions. I'm happy to help you with a lot of the concepts that we'll encounter as we move through this series of lectures. Make sure you download them, watch them, engage with them, and leave me a comment that you did watch it so I can count it for your attendance. Take good care, and I'll see you in the next lecture.